brief on the Madison city budget. What we're going to show you has focused on what the mayor has proposed. We haven't had a chance to include changes from the city council, but you get a sense of the overall document. Just before we do that, just a quick couple words about the forum. The forum is a very old organization, been around for more than a century, and we have offices in both Madison and Milwaukee and do nonpartisan research about all kinds of policy issues in the state that's available on our website for free. I put in the link to the chat. I put in the URL of the budget brief, so you can check that out if you like. Here's just one other I do like to mention, and thank you, Rick and Belinda, for being so kind, that we do have all kinds of members from the corporate, nonprofit, and government worlds, as well as individuals from around the state, including in the Madison area, and would love to, if anyone on the call is interested in joining, would love to talk to you more about that offline. Every year, the forum analyzes the city of Madison, Madison schools, city of Milwaukee, Milwaukee County, Milwaukee Public Schools budget, and every 2 years, like this year, we also analyze the state budget. So, we sort of track what happens in state government all the way down to the local level. All right, so here to look at the 2026 budget proposal for Mayor Satya Rhodes Conway. We started out with a more modest budget shortfall this year. As everyone will recall, in November 2024, residents of the city voted to approve a $22 million operating referendum to increase property taxes in the city's budget by that amount. And that has put the city, as you might expect, in a better financial position today than it was heading into that referendum. Obviously, there's a cost for local residents, but it has been helpful to the city's budget in terms of its fiscal sustainability. This year, we went into with a relatively modest budget shortfall that was solved without the kinds of bigger actions that have had to be taken in recent years, or would have had to have been taken in the absence of the referendum passing. You can see here just what the property tax increase was, what increases in state aid. We'll talk about it. We got some significant increases in state aid this year, which is notable. And our main costs for the city are raises for city staff, which are in the 3% range, a increased general fund subsidy for the the Madison Metro Transit Agency, and just increased costs for debt payments. All right, under the budget, spending would rise by 4.6%. So that's about half again as much as inflation, which is currently running roughly 3%. That is down from the significant spending increase of 6.7% that we had last year. One notable thing, and we'll talk about this later, but when you look at what spending has done for the city over the years, it continues to rise more quickly than the city's revenues can rise on an sort of typical basis year to year, absent a referendum. So that's an ongoing concern for the city, and one that we'll talk about in a little greater depth in a later slide. The city of Madison's budget is relatively simple in the sense that there's just a handful of major program areas: public safety like police, fire, and EMS, debt payments, public works like streets, and transportation, which includes Madison Metro, and the library and the functions around public health and planning and development around the use of land in the city. And, then on the revenue side, really about more than 70%, about 72% of the city's budget is under this proposal, and that's just typical for recent years, is property tax revenue. So, the city of Madison, unlike many other communities with um, lower property values, does not tend to get a lot of state aid, and so is generally dependent on local residents and property taxes for its budget. One notable thing about the property tax levy is that under Wisconsin law, the use of that levy for operations is limited to the percentage increase in, increases in the property tax are limited to increases in property values in the city due to net new construction. And so in a typical year, property values in Madison will increase 2 or 2.25% because of new construction. And so the part of our property tax levy that goes to the city's ongoing operating budget, that's what it can increase by. And again, when you think about the property tax levy, that's well over 2/3 of the city's budget. So, from the get-go, most of the city's budget is, in terms of its revenues, can go up by 2 or 2.25%, and then you just have a larger increase each year in spending, and that's the kind of mismatch that we'll show you a little bit later in this presentation, and that put the city in a position where it sought the referendum and could gradually put the city back in a position like that over time. Here's a look at in terms of where general fund spending for the city would increase or decrease under the mayor's proposed budget. Again, the biggest, about almost half of the new money would go to Metro Transit and debt payments, with some additional funding for police, fire, and EMS. There is a new ambulance crew that would be added under the budget, and the library. There would be a library at Northside Library location that would also open under the proposal. The tax increase would be lower this year than a lot of recent years, obviously because of the referendum. Large increase in the city's gross property tax levy on December 2024 bills. That was 11%, which was the largest that we'd had in decades in Madison. This year, under the mayor's proposal, it would be 2.7%. And you can see there both the blue line, which is what the mayor proposed, and the green line, which is what was allowed under state law. And so you might ask, well, given that the city was just going to referendum to increase by property taxes by more than what state law allows a year ago, why would the mayor's proposal increase property taxes by less than what state law would allow this year? Perhaps a couple reasons for that, but the main one is that there's something called expenditure restraint aid. And because of the referendum, and we could certainly talk about why, but suffice it to say that there's a complicated formula for expenditure restraint aid, and the referendum proved advantageous to the city, and it got several $1,000,000 more in expenditure restraint aid this year. However, if it were to increase its property tax levy by as much as 4% by the allowable amount, it would go over sort of the 4% limit that the formula in state law gives the city of Madison for how much it can raise spending, general fund spending minus debt payments in a given year. So, I realize that's a lot of complicated stuff, but essentially, if the city increases its property tax levy by the full allowable amount, then it would run afoul of this expenditure restraint program limit and would lose a significant amount, in the millions of dollars. I think it's $9 million for the following year. So that's why the city is under the proposal limiting the property tax increase. And if, you guys can stop me, or we can just talk after I'm done if you want to know a little bit more about how that program works. But, you know, in Wisconsin, over time, these different programs and formulas like the levy limits, expenditure restraint limits, this is the same. Melinda and I can talk about this a lot on the school district side. There's all these different measures that get put in place for local governments. And when the legislature does that, they don't always necessarily think about how they're going to work together. And so, this is kind of an example about the somewhat surprising way these things can interact. Okay, next sort of facet of the city budget. For a period of time in recent years, there's been an ongoing concern about, debt payments by the city, its overall debt levels. The city has relatively high per capita debt levels. However, we have high property values, so our debt to property value ratios are more favorable. That's sort of the yin and yang of City of Madison debt. But over time, the share of the city's general fund budget that goes to debt payments, which is your dark blue line, has risen. That has been a little bit more under control in recent years. I mean, one reason for that in part was the, referendum just expanded the size of the city's general fund budget. So, the existing debt payments don't make up as big a share as they used to. That being said, the city is still projecting that debt payments could increase in future years as the city's got to take on additional infrastructure spending. One thing to note about debt payments is that they are not limited under, or they're not covered by the state's levy limits on the city. So, if the city borrows and its debt payments rise as a result of that, it can increase its property tax levy by as much as needed to cover those payments without having to go to referendum. So that's something that's worth noting and not always understood when you talk about debt. So here's a slide that really looks at what I was talking about earlier between the mismatch between what's happening with the city's general fund spending increases each year and what's happening with, sort of the factor that limits its main source of revenue, the property tax. So again, if you look at the dark blue line, that is the percentage increase each year in spending in the city's general fund, which is just its main set of accounts that cover, again, fire, police, streets, libraries, the main city fund. And you can see that in recent years, that's been growing in the 5 to 6% range. It's a little bit less this year because of the expenditure restraint issue that we talked about. It's under the mayor's proposal, it would be 4.6%. And then, as I talked about, the property tax levy for operations in the city is tied to the increase in net new construction. That's generally 2 or 2.25% each year. So you can see that there's a problem in that the city's main revenue source just isn't growing anything like what spending is growing each year. Now, this gap is a little bit less than this chart would suggest because of the fact that the city can raise its property taxes to cover debt. as I talked about, but it gives you a sense of kind of the challenge going forward and why, despite the referendum, as you look out 3, 4, 5 years, the city is going to once again, absent some changes in its approach and policy, have difficulties again fiscally. Now, those difficulties, though, can be handled in the short term, in part because, when we did this year's budget brief, we looked back at the city's financial statements and we found that the city's reserves were doing much better than we understood at the time of the referendum. So if you look at the left panel on this slide, that is the city's general fund balance. Essentially it's assets minus liabilities in its main fund. It's unassigned general fund balance as a percentage of annual budgeted spending in the general fund. And the city target for that is about 15%. And what we saw is by the end of 2024, that rose to 27%. In other words, the reserves in the city's general fund were made up more than a quarter of its budgeted annual spending. So you might say, well, given that the city had such large reserves of like more than $100 million, did it need to do the referendum at as large of amount as it ultimately happened? And, the answer, that's for, in the eye of the beholder, but certainly I think a question that might have been raised at the time if there was information available. Those statements just hadn't come out yet about where the city's reserve position was. And then on the right, I talked about how there's this gap between general fund spending increases and how much the city property taxes and revenues can go up each year. And so, one thing that we give the city some credit for is the mayor and Dave Schmidtke, the finance director, have put forward a multi-year plan to show residents of the city and voters how they would try to close the anticipated budget gaps that are going to open up over the next 5 years. And I think it's worth noting that we look at a lot of local government budgets and they don't, local governments do not always do this. So I think they get some credit for being open and pretty transparent about what their approach is and letting people decide for themselves whether they agree with it. The bottom line is that if you look at the light blue part of the bars that are in the middle, the city is going to use more and more of these reserves that you see in the left panel to help balance the budget over the coming years. And they project they're going to be doing 10 or 11 million of that by the time we get into the 2030s. They're going to do some cuts to city services and fee increases. That's the gray bars. And then the dark blue bars would represent new special charges. During the referendum, the city talked about putting in place something that would be a transportation related fee across the city. It was somewhat similar to fees that have been called transportation utility fees and attempted to be imposed in other communities around the state and that were struck down by the state Supreme Court. The city has said that their fee, they believe it is legally distinct enough that it would be held up in court. It would hold up in court. It certainly could face, some legal scrutiny. So that's something to think about. It's unclear to me if the city is still thinking about going that route in future years, but one way or another, they're looking at the use of special charges. And so now I will hand the presentation over to Tyler, who's going to just do a few concluding slides for you, and then we'll take questions.
Yeah,
Tyler, go
thanks,
ahead.
Jason. So, what we've been talking about the previous 10 slides is all the general fund budget. So now we're going to hit a couple of key other funds. So, these are the fees that you get on your municipal services bill. We're not going to see a jump in the urban forestry fee. Stormwater fees are going to go up a little bit to pay for improvements to storm sewers and debt. Sewage fees are climbing by about 4.5%. That's going to, again, related to increases that MMSD is charging to the city, and then also the city's upgrades to its own services. And then the big increase is the proposed increase in the waterworks bill. That is still under review by the Public Service Commission. When the waterworks, it's a regulated utility, when they want to raise their fees, they have to submit a rate case to PSC, and they either approve or deny it. The impact on a regular customer won't be that 14.8%. A residential customer uses about 4,000 gallons of water per year. We'll see their actual bill jump by about 6%. And so in total, city services bills, if this is all approved, would go up by about $103 for your average customer. We can go to the next slide, Jason. Uh, Talking about the capital budget, thinking about debt service, this is the blue bar at the bottom there. That's general obligation bond. That's where that debt service comes. We see a much smaller overall capital budget in 26 compared to 25. That's due to the fact that the East-West BRT has been completed. It's up and running. Um, and the North-South BRT, all the funds were approved for that as part of the 25 capital budget. That's that gray bar. So the gray bar that kind of goes up and down, that's outside sources of funding. In most of the cases in recent years, that's federal money for BRT. In 25, they approved about $200 million of capital authority uh, that the city could use if that federal money came through. Um, we've looked for and talked to folks to get some clarity on the likelihood of that federal BRT money coming through. I think to sum it all up, it's still uncertain. There are signs that it is moving forward as expected. There are also signs that perhaps the money won't end up coming through. Um, so that's, I think, uncertainty is the word. Um, I'm not sure anyone knows. And so they're going forward as if it's going to happen. But if they receive notification that it's not, then they have sort of contingency plans. Um, but that will need to be addressed in future budgets. The big spending in this year's capital budget, the blue bar, it's noteworthy. General obligation bonding does go up. So that's the city's own borrowed money paid for out of the general fund. That goes up, and that's a couple bigger projects. Major streets gets a big chunk. That's all these rehabilitations on John Nolan, those sorts of things. Um, there's also some money in there for the parks, which is this sort of big lakeway project. Not the same scale in the tens of millions for the parks. And then another big project is a West Side Streets Division facility that's in the $40 million range of borrowing. And that's a new facility to make it easier for the streets folks to get out and plow the roads and cut the grass on the far west side. We can go to the next slide, Jason. Uh, the big, the big non-general fund budget is the transit system, and they interact, right? Where the biggest single increase of the transit or of the general fund comes to supporting Metro Transit. Um, at, at at this point, Metro Transit receives in the neighborhood of $20 million out of their $84 million budget um, from the general fund, which is far higher than it was even before the pandemic. Revenue has been growing. It kind of dropped off a cliff in the pandemic. Revenue's been growing slowly. And one thing of note is that in the 24 budget projections and the 25 budget projections, operating revenue, so that's fares that people pay, but more importantly, um, contracts with the UW, contracts with partners like Epic to pay for ridership. And some advertising, some other cats and dogs in there. That revenue hasn't gone up as much as expected in 24 and 25. They're expecting to see a bigger bump in 26. Again, given the misses on estimates in 24 and 25, I'm a little bit unsure about that gray bar. But because the revenue hasn't rebounded as quickly, that's why we're seeing these general fund transfers into the transit system. And revenue, though not directly a function of how many people are riding, it's not like it's fare box, it's every single fare is what causes the ridership or the revenue to go up and down. We typically have a ridership graph that goes with this one. There are some questions about the ridership data, and in fact, the transit system is in the process of switching how it counts people that get on the buses. They're switching to, a system that is kind of the nationwide standard, but it is a different system. When we looked at the numbers that are published on the FTA website right now, ridership actually fell a little bit over the last 12 months. However, we did get a preview of the numbers that will be submitted to FTA in the future, and it shows that ridership is going up. And so without having a real clear way of analyzing this new data in a short period of time, we just didn't feel comfortable publishing it. But I think the trend in ridership remains to be seen. There are positive indicators, there are negative indicators. So again, uncertainty in the transit system is a big key. And again, looping back to the north-south BRT, it's unclear if that project is going to move forward with the federal funds. And so, we sort of took a I don't know, took a pause on really deeply analyzing ridership trends and the transit system um, for this budget. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. We'll obviously have transit questions. So, um, room taxes are largely recovered, although if you were to adjust for inflation, they're pretty much flat. Um, that's allowed them to there's still a little bit of a structural deficit. That means more revenue, more expenditures than revenue in the um, room tax fund, and they have been able to stop spending down the balance. And in fact, the city a portion of room tax funds goes to the general fund. That amount was actually reduced in order to put a $500,000 reserve. The room tax commission would like to build up sort of a set aside reserve, um, and they were able to make a deposit towards that by reducing the share that gets shifted to the general fund. Um, we can go to the next slide. Uh, Parking revenues, again, they've rebounded. There was a big parking fee increase in the last budget, and then parking use has returned. I think it was something like 6% per year, and so folks are coming back downtown, which I'm sure this group probably is more well aware of that than most. Parking, using the parking structures. But again, it doesn't seem like the use is back to where it was in 2019. It's just that the use has increased and the um, fees have gone up. And so, they have been able to stop the practice of using reserves as well. And so, those two sort of standalone funds are back in better shape. And that's it for that slide. Um,
Great. And I can wrap up with this one, Tyler, and then we'll take questions from everybody. I mean, we've presented these kinds of options before, but we want to note that because, at least right now, the city's budget is not sustainable over the long term. We're always looking at, what are things that the city could do to try and bring those things more into alignment. One thing that we've talked about is continuing to take a regional approach to services, where that might bring in additional revenue and, spread the cost of services over a wider area. I mean, one example is when you look at Middleton and Wanakee, if you look at Sun Prairie, all those communities have been looking in recent years and have worked with the forum on studies to look at fire and EMS spending and services and how those are delivered and whether those communities can work with neighbors. The Village of Cottage Grove is also looking at potentially doing that. In particular, the Village of Cottage Grove might be one community where the city could work with them. And I think, to the credit of the current Madison fire chief and mayor and city council, some of those things have been struck. I mean, certainly Madison Metro has been, continuing to add agreements and arrangements with neighboring communities about their services. Another factor that the city could consider or approach that would help to bring its budget more into line fiscally is to limit wage increases. Now, there is potential drawbacks to that as well. I mean, the city's had challenges with turnover and vacancies of its positions in recent years, like many different employers. So there's always a certain tension about how much you can do that without affecting services and making it hard to, deliver on what residents of the city expect. Tyler talked a little bit about fee increases, which is something that the city has done in recent years. Some of those fee increases, like the urban forestry fee, would be under limits based on state law that you could not go beyond a certain amount. In other cases, like the city's vehicle registration fee, which is currently at a flat $40 fee per vehicle, the city could, under state law, increase those by more, but there is a certain, potentially political limit to what the city could do based on just how residents view those fees. And then, another approach that has come up and that was used successfully by the city of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County in 2023 was lobbying the legislature for some sort of sales tax authority. Typically in the Midwest, communities the size of Madison do have the ability to levy or impose a sales tax. There's obviously trade-offs to that as well, in that, for City of Madison merchants, that could be an issue, as well as for, residents of the city, it would be an additional cost. At the same time, it would also have the benefit that when visitors come into the city for an overture performance or a Badger game or what have you, they would contribute some revenues for the services that they're using as tourists and visitors. Currently, the city is very heavily dependent on resident businesses and homeowners for paying for the cost of city services through the property tax. And so that is the end of our proposal, and we will our presentation, and we'll try and now put it back to all of you for questions.
Thank you again, Jason and Tyler. I need to hop off a little early for another meeting, but we'll get started with questions, and then John and Madeline will handle it from there and wrap things up on time. Any questions from folks? Peggy, and I can't see everyone, so hopefully you were the first with your yellow hand up.
Thank you. I'm curious if obviously the mayor and others have continually tried to work with the state to try and get more state revenue. We hear that often. Do you have any inclination as to where the status is of it now? I get a sense it's not changed a lot, although I'm hearing otherwise. Do you know?
Sure. Well, the city did have a fairly successful year in terms of getting more state aid this year. Part of that, I think, was a real deliberate effort that was successful, and that was to increase funding for something called the Payments for Municipal Services program. And so, the state government, as you guys all know from the university and the state office buildings, is one of the big residents of the city, and they do not pay property taxes, as you know. And what that program exists for the state to sort of make at least a partial payment for the services, the fire, street plowing, all these services that those organizations use, or that those buildings use. And something like for 20 years, that appropriation had not been increased for communities all around the state. And so what was happening is they would just, every year they would calculate the cost that the state should be paying and then prorate that by a smaller and smaller percentage. And, obviously that affected communities around the state, like any community with a UW campus, city of Milwaukee. But Madison took the biggest hit from that. And there was a significant increase to that appropriation in the budget. And that resulted in about 2.4 million in additional payments from the state to the city. So that's, again, when you think about the general fund budget, it's more than 400 million. So that's less than a 1% increase, but it's nevertheless, that's real money for the city, 2.5 million. And then the city had an increase in its expenditure restraint program payment that was a little more than 2 million. And we sort of lucked into that one, I would say, in some ways, at least. Now, maybe Dave Schmidtke understood that this would happen. I did not fully understand that we could see that much of an increase essentially due to the referendum. And I could explain to you offline the complicated reasons why that resulted in an increase in the referendum, but it did give us more than $2 million extra in that program. And so that was also helpful. So you add those two things together, and that was at least like a 1% budget bump for the city. So, I think that shows, together with what happened in the city of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County, that even though it's a Republican-held legislature, they're not maybe thinking every day about things they can do for the city of Madison. Having that exchange with the legislature can be beneficial, and is probably something that makes sense for the city to try and do going forward.
Thank you, Peggy and Jason. Other questions?
Hi. Could you just confirm the difference in how Metro's reporting their ridership? Tyler, you had mentioned that the numbers were different, and it's my understanding that that's due to the new payment system. Could you speak to that?
Yeah,
Or-
I'll try a fumbling version of it, and then Tyler can come in and clean up what I've said. The city has had a couple things happen. One, it's changed the method of payment for people entering the buses, and so that changes part of the counting system. And then in addition, bus drivers have traditionally had a button that they pressed as people got onto the bus as a count of the passengers. And they're transitioning away from this button, but for a period of time, there was confusion, and drivers should have been continuing to press the button, but they were not. And so there's several factors, and those are at least a couple of them that have, according to Metro Transit, affected counts. And Tyler, what can you add or subtract from what I just said?
Yeah, so that's the sort of short-term explanation as to why we're seeing, even in the existing data, a little bit of a decline, in addition to just simply as they shift to the payment systems, the counting wasn't working as well on the old payment systems, those sorts of things. They're shifting then to a automated process for counting, where instead of the bus driver having to push a button or the counting process be anytime someone puts in a pass, that's when a count is done. To sort of a turnstile counting mechanism where everybody that gets on the bus gets counted. And from our conversations with them and our understanding, this is sort of how most transit systems have been doing it for a while. Interestingly, when other transit systems in the past have shifted to this counting system, they will see increases in ridership um, in the neighborhood of 10 to 15%, 20%, right? Just because they're counting more accurately now, and they were counting people they were missing before. And so it's not an actual increase, it's a uh, increase in what was counted. It's more accurate count. Um, so it's likely that we will see in the new data an an increase simply by counting people that had already been riding the bus that are now actually being counted. However, in some of the preliminary data that we've seen, there may be a jump beyond that sort of just counting more people that were already on the bus. But again, we're hesitant to kind of come down and say, oh, it looks like it's up or it looks like it's down, because these numbers are still preliminary. They haven't been fully signed off on by FTA. And because we haven't been able to sort of analyze, okay, this is just counting people that were always on the bus, and this is new people on the bus, or, is it actually going down? But that should, sort of to sum up, the old counting system was getting worse because of operator error and material failures of the buses. The new counting system is going to catch more people, so it's going to be difficult to tell if ridership went up or if we're just counting the same people that have always been riding the bus.
Thanks. As a daily bus commuter, you mentioning the button, this is the first time that anyone has mentioned the button when we've talked about the counting, but now that you say that, I have not heard the beeps of the driver hitting the button for the riders. So thank you.
Yeah.
That is one point that I have not heard made in any of the public discussions I've heard of this.
And
Thank
and
you.
and this button mechanism, I mean, the idea is like when there's a stop on university with a bunch of students jumping on, the way to count those students was for the bus driver to just sort of hit a button a bunch of times, and that was always the system in the past. And so, on one hand, you can see why they'd want to shift away from that method. On the other hand, it is an interesting time to make that switch. There'll be a lot of fun data analysis to do on transit ridership for the next budget brief. But yeah, it was a very manual process, it seemed like.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have better information for you a year from now. So I think Dan had his hand
Yes.
raised.
Yeah, I've got two questions. I think both of them are for you, Jason. The first one is sort of just technical, maybe, and then the second one is maybe a little bit more challenging. On like your third slide, you were showing the year-over-year spending, and I noticed it tends to yo-yo year in and year out.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could comment on that pattern.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. There are some city expenses that do change from year to year. So one of those would be the election spending. So, you will see much higher spending by the city clerk's office in midterm and especially presidential years. There can be some fluctuation in debt payments. So those are some things that contribute to that. There can also just be some differences in, aid received and things like that from the state. But no, I mean, I don't necessarily have a great explanation for you about why you've seen, I mean, some of those past years also do reflect differences in state law. So you did have some years where the levy limits were tightened, and then that ratchets down state spending more or city spending more than it otherwise would. In recent years, it has been in the neighborhood of like 5.5 to 6 or 7%. And so it's been a little bit more in a given range. Now some of that spending increases does reflect federal money from the pandemic, so maybe the spending increases wouldn't have been as big without that. But I think the main thing that's causing it to go down this year at least is and not be, more in a realm like 5% like typical, is this whole issue with the expenditure restraint aid. So I'd say maybe in everything I've said there, maybe that accounts for like 30 or 40% of the variation, and then the rest I'm unable to explain for you. But those are at least some factors that contribute.
Appreciate it. And then I've got one more, which I don't know if you'll be able to explain either, but I'm going to let you try it. It was your last slide before you turned it over to Tyler, just looking ahead at the projected expenditures, and it seems like the city has a lot riding on you spending from reserves and making up gaps from fees that don't exist yet, and may not ever come to fruition. And I was just wondering if you might want to try to take a comment on the soundness of this plan, given we're banking so much on reserves that are going to go away, and what are we doing when the reserves go away,
Yeah,
and so much on charges that don't exist yet.
yeah, that's a great question. I think on the reserves in the short term, it's a little more reasonable in the sense that, right now we project that reserves are something like a quarter of city spending. Given that most of our revenue in the general fund comes from the property tax, which is very stable, it's different than like an income or sales tax. I think most people would probably say the city doesn't need reserves to be that high. And, using some of them to limit property tax increases or support things that the city needs to do, especially if it's one-time spending, could be, reasonable, and to bring the reserves back closer to that 15% target rather than like 25%. Um, However, when you're getting to where you're using into the $10 million and up of reserves every year, the city obviously can't do that forever. And so that's why we're trying to emphasize that it does need to think long-term about things that would be more sustainable, either in terms of spending curbs or revenue increases. Something that might be sustainable would be new special charges, but as you say, some of those, we don't really know yet what might be trotted out in that domain. We do know the transportation related fee that the city had talked about in the fall of 2024. And although, the city attorney and other city officials have made sort of statements and arguments about why they feel that fee would be different from the kinds of transportation utility fees that have been struck down by the Supreme Court, that could still end up, facing, people and, businesses in the city that might have to pay that would still look at that and perhaps even, have some kind of a legal challenge. So, I think that is definitely something to keep an eye on if that is our main city plan for closing budget gaps in future years.
Yeah.
I mean, the one thing I will say to complete that is the city could always fall back on a wheel tax increase that would be legally solid, and that, although I know there's been some legislation in the legislature to actually require a referendum to increase the wheel tax, but absent that legislation passing, the city could do it. There just may be some political response. If the city were to double that fee or something, that would not sit well perhaps with all city residents.
And just to sort of, say, well, okay, so we talked about the revenues, right? And so there's the special charge, well, question mark. Wheel tax, again, question mark. We know that the property taxes can only go up by what they're going to go up by. And so then you start thinking about finding reductions or efficiencies or all those fun words of the magnitude of those big, scary, dark blue bars in 29, 30, 31. And it's very difficult to get savings of that magnitude in a city budget. If you go back to slide 8, it's very difficult to get savings of those magnitudes without hitting those top 2 or 3 bars. And so then that's talking about limiting increases or finding savings in places like police and fire and EMS. Again, the the small gray bar of the 3 million magnitude, you can probably find that in places that, you know, um, might pinch less. But I think if you're going to find in the 20s to 30 millions of savings over a long period of time, you have to go to core services. And so, I think on one hand, you can think about increasing revenue. What are the options there? You can also think about trying to find savings. And given that personnel, especially, sort of public safety personnel are big costs, it can be difficult to find those sorts of savings without
Yeah.
impacting services.